Indian entrepreneurs abroad. Growing food and other crops for the world market required capital. Large plantations could borrow it from banks and markets. But what about the humble peasant? Enter the Indian banker. Do you know of the Shikaripur Shroffs and Nattukottai Chettiars? They were amongst the many groups of bankers and traders who financed export agriculture in Central and Southeast Asia, using either their own funds or those borrowed from European banks. They had a sophisticated system to transfer money over large distances and even developed indigenous forms of corporate organization. Indian traders and moneylenders also followed European colonizers into Africa. Hyderabadi Sindhi traders, however, ventured beyond European colonies. From the 1860s, they established flourishing emporia at busy ports worldwide, selling local and imported curios to tourists whose numbers were beginning to swell, thanks to the development of safe and comfortable passenger vessels. Indian trade, colonialism, and the global system. Historically, fine cottons produced in India were exported to Europe. With industrialization, British cotton manufacture began to expand, and industrialists pressurized the government to restrict cotton imports and protect local industries. Tariffs were imposed on cloth imports into Britain. Consequently, the inflow of fine Indian cotton began to decline. From the early 19th century, British manufacturers also began to seek overseas markets for their cloth. Excluded from the British market by tariff barriers, Indian textiles now face stiff competition into other international markets. If we look at the figures of exports from India, we see a steady decline of the share of cotton textiles from some 30% around 1800 to 15% by 1815. By the 1870s, this proportion had dropped to below 3%. What then did India export? The figures again tell a dramatic story. While exports of manufactures declined rapidly, export of raw materials increased equally fast. Between 1812 and 1871, the share of raw cotton exports rose from 5% to 35%. Indigo used for dyeing cloth was another important export for many decades. And as you have read last year, opium shipments to China grew rapidly from the 1820s to become for a while India's single largest export. Britain grew opium in India and exported it to China, and with the money earned through this sale, it financed its tea and other imports from China. Over the 19th century, British manufacturers market. Food grains and raw material exports from India to Britain and the rest of the world increased. But the value of the British exports to India was much higher than the value of British imports from India. Thus, Britain had a trade surplus with India. Britain used this surplus to balance its trade deficits with other countries, that is, with countries from which Britain was importing more than it was selling to. This is how a multilateral settlement system works. It allows one country's deficit with another country to be settled by its surplus with a third country. By helping Britain balance its deficits, India played a crucial role in the late 19th century world economy. Britain's trade surplus in India also helped pay the so-called home charges that included private remittances home by British officials and traders, interest payments on India's external debt, and pensions of British officials in India. Wartime transformations. The First World War, as you know, was fought between two power blocs. On the one side were the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia, later joined by the US, and the opposite side were the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey. When the war began in August 1914, many governments thought it would be over by Christmas. It lasted more than 4 years. The First World War was a war like no other before. The fighting involved the world's leading industrial nations, which now harness the vast powers of modern industry to inflict the greatest possible destruction on their enemies. This war was thus the first modern industrial war. It saw the use of machine guns, tanks, aircrafts, chemical weapons, etc. on a massive scale. These were all increasingly products of modern, large-scale industry. To fight the war, millions of soldiers had to be recruited from around the world and moved to the front lines on large ships and trains. The scale of death and destruction, 9 million dead and 20 million injured, was unthinkable before the industrial age without the use of industrial arms. Most of the killed and maimed were men of working age. These deaths and injuries reduced the able-bodied workforce in Europe. With fewer numbers within the family, household incomes declined after the war. During the war, industries were restructured to produce war-related goods. Entire societies were also reorganized for war. As men went to battle, women stepped in to undertake jobs that earlier only men were expected to do. The war led to the snapping of economic links between some of the world's largest economic powers, which were now fighting each other to pay for them. So Britain borrowed large sums of money from the US banks as well as the US public. Thus, the war transformed the US from being an international debtor to an international creditor. In other words, at the war's end, the US and its citizens owned more overseas assets than foreign governments and citizens owned in the US. Post-war recovery. Post-war economic recovery proved difficult. Britain, which was the world's leading economy in the pre-war period, in particular, faced a prolonged crisis. While Britain was preoccupied with war, industries had developed in India and Japan. After the war, Britain found it difficult to recapture its earlier position of dominance in the Indian market and to compete with Japan internationally. Moreover, to finance the war expenditures, Britain had borrowed liberally from the US. This meant that at the end of the war, Britain was burdened with huge external debts. The war had led to an economic boom, that is, to a large increase in demand, production, and employment. When the war boom ended, production contracted and unemployment increased. At the same time, the government reduced bloated war expenditures to bring them into line with peacetime revenues. These developments led to huge job losses. In 1921, 1 in every 5 British workers was out of work. Indeed, anxiety and uncertainty about work became an enduring part of the post-war scenario. Many agricultural economies were also in crisis. Consider the case of wheat producers. Before the war, Eastern Europe was a major supplier of wheat in the world market. When this supply was disrupted during the war, wheat production in Canada, America, and Australia expanded dramatically. But once the war was over, production in Eastern Europe revived and created a glut in wheat output. Grain prices fell, rural incomes declined, and farmers fell deeper into debt.